Hello and happy Telltale Thursday. And boy, do we have a treat for you today. But check this out. See my box? How cool is that? But what do we use boxes for? Normally we use boxes to store items. But what do you think about a person being in a box? I don't know. Of course, we would need it to be a little bigger for a person to actually fit inside. Well, I know for myself, a box, but I don't know. Today's story is entitled Henry's Freedom Box. And here's our character, Henry, and I wonder what he has to do with a box. I don't know, but we have to read. Remember, an author is a person who writes the words, and an illustrator is a person that draws the pictures. So our author for today is Levine, and our illustrator is Kadir Nelson. So let's get started, shall we? Henry's Freedom Box, a true story from the Underground Railroad. And we know that the Underground Railroad is not a real railroad system, but it was a system that helped slaves escape to freedom. So, I wonder if Henry escapes. Let's see. Let's read. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. You know, a slave is a person who's owned by another person, and they have to do things that their master wants them to do. They're not free to do whatever they want to do. So, Henry was a slave. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. I could not imagine being torn away from my family. Could you? One morning, the slave master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. Ill is another word for sick. It's a synonym, actually, for sick. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he did not say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. He was telling his family goodbye. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. That's what they did to slaves. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. He was so excited because he met someone. I believe he was falling in love. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another, and another. So what does that make total? 3 children. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was very worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. And by the way, if you notice in the picture right there, Henry is playing what you call a banjo. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." Imagine that. Imagine hearing that news. "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco." The boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. His entire family sold. Imagine that. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. So imagine how he felt. Imagine how you would feel if you were told that you will never see your family again. Very sad, very difficult for Henry. Many weeks passed, but one morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky. And Henry thought about what? Being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, and we know a crate is a type of box, he knew the answer. So what do you think he perhaps might do right now? What do you think he's thinking? He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "Well, what if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Of course, that's on the East Coast of the United States. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." Well, Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger. But Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready?" he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. So I wonder, was he on water? Maybe on a boat. I don't know. This must be the steamboat. Yeah, we were right. For Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move because someone might hear him. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side. Now on his left. Right and our left. And suddenly, right side up. Yay for Henry. Because remember, blood was rushing to his head. He was turning hot. So good thing now he is right side up. "What do you think is in here?" said the first man. "I am male," thought Henry, but not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. Welcome to Philadelphia. At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1849. Actually, his birthday is coming up this month. His first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Do you know what his middle name was? Everyone called him Henry Box Brown. And that is the end of our story. So, did you enjoy that story? I did. Would you be willing to take the sacrifice that Henry took, mailing himself to freedom? Let me just tell you a little bit more about what happened. In the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons, and historians believe between 60,000 to 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom. And remember what we said in the beginning, that was called the Underground Railroad system. Of course, it wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the South to the north. The fugitives hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and ice-bound rivers in winter. They traveled any way they could to reach freedom. Man, can you believe that? They traveled far and through dangerous, dangerous times. Because you know what could have happened if they got caught? They could have gotten killed. So, we are thankful now that we are not slaves, that we are free. So I hope that you enjoyed this story, Henry's Freedom Box.